Imagine, for just a moment, a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood. Quiet, serene, a place where families are supposed to feel safe. It's early morning in Frederick, Colorado. The sun is just starting to rise over the horizon, casting a soft golden light over neatly kept homes, white picket fences, and playgrounds where children's laughter fills the air. In places like this, tragedy feels like a distant concept, something that happens far away, to people you don't know. Yet, on August 13th, 2018, something unimaginable happened that shattered this peaceful illusion. The story alone leaves us with burning questions. Why would a husband, the father of two beautiful young girls and with another child on the way, murder his entire family? How does a man go from family photos, smiles, and vacations to committing one of the most heart-wrenching acts of betrayal imaginable? What could drive someone to destroy everything they helped build? Today, we're diving into the case that left an entire nation horrified and asking why. By all accounts, the Watts family seemed to have it all. Chris and Shanann Watts appeared to be living the American dream. Loving parents raising two young daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, in their suburban home. Shanann was also 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico. She was an active social media user, frequently posting updates about her family's life, her work, and her excitement about her growing family. On the surface, they seemed like a tight-knit, happy family, the kind you see smiling in holiday cards. But as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. On the morning of August 13th, Shanann was supposed to have a routine doctor's appointment to check on her pregnancy, but she never showed. She had just returned home from a business trip late the night before and was expected to be exhausted, but her friend, Nicola Atkinson, who had dropped her off, grew increasingly concerned when Shanann didn't return any of her texts or calls. Nicole knew something was wrong. Shanann was the type to always respond, especially with her busy work schedule and responsibilities as a mother, so when the silence stretched into hours, it felt like a glaring red flag. Nicola didn't waste any time. She drove to the Watts home, ringing the doorbell and knocking on the door, hoping to find her friend inside, but there was no answer. This is where the first wave of unease sets in. Shanann's car was still parked in the driveway. Her purse, phone, and even her shoes were found inside the house. It was as if she and the girls had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. Nicole's instincts told her something was seriously wrong. When Chris Watts arrived home, his demeanor seemed calm, collected. Too calm, perhaps. He told police that Shanann had left the house with the girls after an argument early that morning. He speculated that she might have taken off to clear her head or visit someone, but none of it made sense. Shanann was not the type to disappear without letting someone know. She was devoted to her children and her routine, and the idea of her walking out without her car or any of the necessities she would need for her kids didn't add up. As the minutes turned into hours, and the hours into an agonizing day, the situation grew increasingly dire. The local police department was quick to respond, given the circumstances, but what they couldn't have known at that time was that this case was about to make national headlines. While search teams began to mobilize, looking for any sign of Shanann and the girls, Chris Watts stepped in front of the media, asking for their safe return. If you saw Chris in those early interviews, you might have felt sympathy for him. After all, here was a father, seemingly distraught, pleading for the safe return of his pregnant wife and young daughters. His voice cracked as he addressed the cameras, saying, "If somebody has them, please bring them back." It was a scene straight out of the nightmare any parent hopes they never have to live through. But was it real? Or was it just the first act of a horrifying charade? Behind Chris's calm exterior, investigators began to feel that something wasn't quite right. For starters, Chris had been cooperative. Too cooperative. Offering just enough detail to make his story sound plausible, but not enough to explain the many questions that began to arise. How could a mother and two young children leave without a trace? Why would Shanann take nothing with her if she was planning to leave? And why did Chris seem so unemotional, almost robotic in his interactions? The more the investigators dug, the more Chris's story began to unravel. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera showed something that didn't fit with his version of events. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn on the day of Shanann's disappearance, the footage captured Chris backing his truck into the garage. He had told investigators that he went straight to work that morning after the argument with Shanann, but the video showed him loading something into the truck. Something big, something heavy. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to fall into place. Chris's behavior, his overly controlled demeanor, the security footage, all of it was beginning to suggest a darker truth, one far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As the investigation intensified and the police began to press Chris for answers, the nation waited with bated breath. What had really happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and how far was Chris willing to go to keep his secrets hidden? By now, Chris was becoming the prime suspect in a case that was beginning to look less like a disappearance and more like a calculated crime. But the burning question remained. Why? What could possibly motivate a man to commit such an unthinkable act? As we delve further into the story, we will uncover the chilling truth behind the facade of a loving family and the deadly lengths one man went to in order to escape a life he no longer wanted. This is the story of Shanann Watts and her daughters, a family destroyed by betrayal, lies, and murder. And by the end of this story, you'll find yourself wondering how someone could commit such a horrific act and why none of us saw it coming. Frederick, Colorado. It's the kind of town where nothing bad ever seems to happen. The kind of place where neighbors wave to each other as they mow their lawns and kids run freely through backyards with their friends. A place where the biggest event of the week might be a neighborhood barbecue or a kid's birthday party. But beneath the tranquil surface of this quiet, close-knit community, something was about to unfold that no one could have ever imagined. The LCZ operation. The date was August 13th, 2018. And for the Watts family, it was a day that started like any other, but would end in a nightmare that would send shockwaves across the nation. At the center of this tragic story was 34-year-old Shanann Watts, a devoted mother, loving wife, and successful businesswoman. Shanann had built her life around her family. She and her husband, Chris Watts, had two beautiful daughters, Bella and Celeste. Shanann was also 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a son they had already named Nico. She had just returned from a business trip the night before, tired but eager to be back home with her family. But by that morning, something was terribly wrong. Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were nowhere to be found. It was Nicole Atkinson, one of Shanann's closest friends, who first noticed that something wasn't right. Nicole had been the one to drop Shanann off at home after their business trip together, and they had exchanged messages the night before. When Shanann didn't show up for her scheduled doctor's appointment that morning, Nicole began to worry. She knew Shanann was meticulous, organized to a fault, missing a doctor's appointment, not answering calls or texts. That wasn't like her at all. Nicole tried to brush off her growing concern. Maybe Shanann was just exhausted. Maybe she had turned off her phone to get some much-needed rest. But as the hours ticked by and her calls remained unanswered, the uneasy feeling in the pit of Nicole's stomach grew. Something was wrong. She could feel it. And so, around lunchtime, Nicole drove over to the Watts family home. She pulled up to the driveway, half expecting to find Shanann there, maybe napping or playing with the kids. But what she saw instead made her heart race. Shanann's car was still parked in the driveway, exactly where it had been the night before. But there was no sign of Shanann or the girls. The house was eerily quiet. Nicole rang the doorbell. No answer. She knocked on the door, louder this time, hoping that Shanann would come to the door, apologizing for the scare, but still, nothing. The house remained silent, almost as if it were holding its breath. Nicole's mind raced. Where could Shanann be? Why wasn't she answering? She peered through the windows. There was Shanann's purse sitting on the counter and her phone, still inside. Her shoes were by the door. It didn't make sense. How could she leave without any of her essentials? By now, the sinking feeling in Nicole's gut was undeniable. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was something more. Something darker. Nicole wasted no time. She called the police. When the officers arrived, they entered the Watts home with Chris Watts, who had just come home from work. Chris seemed calm, even cooperative, as he spoke with the officers, explaining that Shanann had left with the girls earlier that morning after they'd had a disagreement. He suggested that maybe she had gone to a friend's house to cool off, maybe even to her parents' place. But his words didn't sit well with anyone who knew Shanann. She wasn't the type to storm off without telling anyone, especially not without her car, her phone, or anything for the kids. The story Chris was telling simply didn't line up with the Shanann her friends and family knew. As the hours stretched on, the tension began to build. The police initiated a search, canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, hoping that someone had seen something, anything, that could provide a clue as to where Shanann, Bella, and Celeste had gone. But no one had seen them. Back at the Watts home, Chris continued to play the part of the concerned husband. He let the police search the house, walk them through the rooms, and answered their questions without hesitation. But something about his demeanor struck some of the officers as odd. He was cooperative, yes, but there was something too controlled about his responses. Too calm, too rehearsed, almost as if he were following a script. The neighbors began to gather, murmuring amongst themselves, watching from their yards as the police went in and out of the house. Speculation grew. Had Shanann left Chris? Had she taken the kids and run away? But those who knew Shanann dismissed the idea immediately. She was dedicated to her family, her children. There was no way she would just leave without a word. As the hours turned into days, the search intensified. News of Shanann and her daughter's disappearance spread like wildfire. Soon their faces were plastered on every news outlet across the country. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, hoping for any new developments. The nation was captivated, holding its breath, waiting for answers. Chris, meanwhile, appeared on television, pleading for the safe return of his wife and children. His voice cracked as he begged for their return, but there was something off, something hollow in his words. Could a man who was so emotionally detached really be grieving the sudden loss of his family? Or was he hiding something far more sinister? Behind the scenes, investigators were starting to piece together the puzzle. The more they looked into Chris's story, the more questions arose. And then came the breakthrough. Footage from a neighbor's security camera that showed Chris loading something into his truck in the early hours of the morning, before he had claimed to leave for work. The cracks in Chris' story were beginning to show. The calm, collected facade he had maintained for days was starting to crumble. Investigators pressed him harder, and the pressure began to mount. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. One thing becomes clear: this wasn't just a disappearance. This was something far more chilling, and the answers that were about to emerge would shock the world. What happened next, no one could have predicted. The story would take a devastating turn, and the true horror of what had occurred inside the Watts family home would be revealed in a way that left everyone reeling. The cracks in Chris's story were beginning to show, but at this point, few could have anticipated just how deeply those cracks ran. Investigators were starting to suspect that there was much more to the disappearance of Shanann and her daughters than met the eye, but they didn't have enough to go on. Yet. As Chris stood in front of the cameras, pleading for his family's safe return, the entire country watched. His words sounded desperate, heartbroken even, as he told reporters how incomplete his house felt without his wife and daughters there. He described the eerie silence of his home, how it felt empty without their presence, and begged anyone who might know where they were to come forward. "If you're out there," Chris said in one of his early interviews, his voice cracking, "just come back. Like, if somebody has her, just bring her back. I need to see everybody. This house is not complete without anybody here." On the surface, it seemed like the plea of a devastated husband and father. But something about his demeanor didn't sit well with those who were watching, especially not the investigators. Chris's emotions seemed forced, his responses robotic. There was an unsettling calmness about him, something almost unnatural for a man who had supposedly lost his entire family. The media latched onto the story. It wasn't just a local case anymore, it had turned into a national obsession. News outlets ran headlines about the missing mother and her daughters, showing photos of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste with their bright smiles and innocent faces. The public too became invested. Social media lit up with hashtags like "Find Shanann," "Bring Bella Home," and "Find Celeste." People shared posts, hoping to spread awareness and maybe, just maybe, help bring this family home safely. But behind the scenes, something wasn't adding up. Investigators continued their search, knocking on doors in the neighborhood, interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something that could provide a clue. They searched the Watts home, trying to piece together the timeline Chris had provided. Friends and neighbors were questioned. Everyone wanted to believe that this was just a case of a mother taking her kids and leaving for a few days, that Shanann and the girls were safe somewhere, but with each passing hour, hope was beginning to fade. The footage from a neighbor's security camera became a key piece of the puzzle. The video showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway early in the morning, just before he left for work. Something that stood out immediately to the investigators. Why would he need to back the truck in at that hour? And what was he loading into it? The video didn't provide all the answers, but it raised enough questions to make the investigators dig deeper into Chris's story. As they pressed him, Chris's calm facade began to crack. He was still maintaining that he had no idea where Shanann and the girls were, but his behavior became more erratic under the pressure. His timeline didn't quite make sense, his answers were vague, and he seemed strangely detached for a man whose entire family had just vanished. And then there was something else. A secret that Chris had been hiding. Investigators discovered that Chris was having an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger. She had been unaware of the depth of his family life at first, but over time the truth had come out. Chris had told her that he was in the process of separating from Shanann, that they were planning to split up, but the reality was that Shanann had no idea about the affair or any plans for separation. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Could this be the motive behind the disappearance? Was Chris so desperate to start a new life with Nicole that he had done something terrible to his wife and children? Investigators began to focus on this angle, and the pressure on Chris intensified. Meanwhile, the media attention was growing. The public watched closely as Chris continued to appear on television, pleading for his family's return. But now, there was an air of suspicion around him. People were beginning to question whether his emotional pleas were genuine or whether they were part of a larger act. Social media became a battleground of opinions. Some still believed Chris was a grieving husband, while others were convinced he was hiding something far more sinister. The police were now in a race against time. The longer Shanann and the girls were missing, the less likely it seemed that they would be found alive. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. As the investigation ramped up, Chris's behavior only grew more erratic. He became increasingly uncomfortable under questioning, and investigators began to notice inconsistencies in his story. His calm, composed exterior was starting to unravel, and those closest to him were beginning to doubt the man they thought they knew. The Watts family home, once a symbol of a happy suburban life, was now under intense scrutiny. Investigators combed through every inch of the house, looking for any signs of what might have happened to Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. They searched the garage, the backyard, the bedrooms. Nothing was left unchecked. But despite their efforts, they still didn't have the evidence they needed to confirm their suspicions. But something was about to give. The investigation had reached a tipping point, and it was becoming clear that Chris wasn't being entirely truthful. Investigators knew they had to apply even more pressure, and they were getting closer to the moment when the truth would finally come to light. It was only a matter of time before Chris would break, and when he did, the nation would be left in disbelief, grappling with the horrific details of what had truly happened to Shanann and her daughters. The facade of the perfect suburban family had been shattered, and the world was about to learn just how far Chris Watts had gone to cover up his darkest secret. The investigation had reached a critical point, and the pressure on Chris Watts was at its peak. Behind the scenes, investigators had been piecing together every clue, scrutinizing every word, every action Chris had made since the moment Shanann and the girls disappeared. They knew they were close to uncovering the full truth, but they needed Chris to confess. What followed was a calculated, strategic plan by law enforcement to break through his facade, and it all began with the polygraph test. Chris had agreed to take the polygraph, likely believing he could manipulate the situation or that it would somehow clear him of suspicion. But the investigators weren't fooled. By this point, they were already certain that Chris was hiding something. The polygraph was just a tool to confirm their suspicions and, more importantly, to give Chris a false sense of control. As he sat in the sterile room, the quiet buzz of the polygraph machine filling the air, the tension was palpable. The test didn't take long. Once it was over, the results were undeniable. Chris had failed. And with that failure, the last bit of his carefully constructed story began to crumble. He had lied, and now, investigators had the proof they needed to confront him directly. But it wasn't just the polygraph that was damning. As Chris sat in that interrogation room, the investigators already had more information than he realized. The answer came from Alan Lative, the chief of the international branch, who was asked to do some observatory. They had spoken to neighbors, analyzed security footage, and most importantly, they had dug into his personal life. They knew about his affair with Nicole Kessinger, and they knew that the image of the devoted family man Chris had tried to project was nothing more than a mask. The interrogation that followed was intense, designed to chip away at Chris's defenses. The investigators pushed him, asking him over and over to explain the inconsistencies in his story. How could he claim to have no idea where his wife and daughters were, yet his truck had been seen leaving the house early that morning? Why was he loading something into the truck at such an unusual hour? And why had his behavior been so calm, so detached, during a time when most people would have been frantic with worry? At first, Chris stuck to his story. He insisted that Shanann had taken the girls and left after a disagreement. But as the hours ticked by and the questions became more pointed, Chris's confidence began to waver. He could feel the walls closing in, and, in a desperate attempt to save himself, he made a shocking claim. It was Shanann, he said. Shanann had killed their daughters. In a rage, after he told her he wanted a separation, she had snapped and taken the lives of Bella and Celeste. According to Chris, he had walked in on the horrific scene, finding his wife standing over their lifeless bodies. In his version of events, Chris wasn't the monster. He was the victim, a grieving father who had been forced to kill Shanann in self-defense, in a moment of uncontrollable anger and horror. It was a stunning accusation, one that momentarily left even the seasoned investigators taken aback. But they weren't buying it. They had seen enough of Chris's behavior to know that something far darker was at play. His story didn't match the evidence they had gathered. The timeline didn't make sense. And most of all, Chris's demeanor was all wrong. Even as he tried to shift the blame onto Shanann, there was no real emotion in his voice. No anger, no grief, no sorrow. Just cold, calculated words. Investigators continued to press Chris, knowing that this false narrative wouldn't hold up. They pointed out the inconsistencies, the contradictions, and slowly but surely, Chris began to realize that his lies were unraveling. The pressure was mounting, and Chris was running out of options. Finally, in a moment of desperation, Chris broke. The lies, the deceit, the carefully crafted story he had been telling for days, it all fell apart in a single, devastating confession. Chris admitted that he had strangled Shanann in their bedroom that morning. There had been no argument, no fight about separation. In fact, Shanann had likely gone to bed that night completely unaware of what was about to happen. Chris, who had been carrying on his affair with Nicole and planning a future without his family, had made the decision to end their lives in the most horrific way imaginable. But the horror didn't end there. After killing Shanann, Chris loaded her body into his truck. His two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, were still alive. He put them in the truck with their mother's lifeless body and drove them to a remote oil field where he worked. It was there, in the shadow of towering oil tanks, that Chris committed the unthinkable. He smothered both of his daughters, one after the other, and disposed of their small bodies in the oil tanks. Chris remembers being terrified. Bella, the eldest, had reportedly fought back, pleading for her life in her final moments. But Chris was unmoved. His mind was set on carrying out this unimaginable act of violence. He then dug a shallow grave for Shanann and buried her, hoping that the remote location would keep his horrific crime hidden forever. But Chris had underestimated the determination of law enforcement and the weight of his own conscience. By the time investigators had arrived at the oil field to recover the bodies, Chris's confession had already sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. The media, which had been covering the story with growing intensity, was now reporting on the gruesome details of the murders. News outlets broadcast the footage of investigators at the oil field, their grim task unfolding in real time. The nation, already captivated by the story of the missing mother and her daughters, was now grappling with the horrific reality of what had happened. Chris Watts, the seemingly ordinary man with the picture-perfect family, had committed one of the most heinous acts imaginable. He had taken the lives of his pregnant wife and his 2 young daughters, all in a cold, calculated effort to start a new life with another woman. The facade he had worked so hard to maintain had been shattered, and the true nature of his monstrous actions was now laid bare for the world to see. As the full scope of Chris's crimes came to light, the question on everyone's mind was, why? Why would a man seemingly living a comfortable life with a beautiful family commit such a horrific act? What had driven Chris Watts to murder his entire family in cold blood? To anyone on the outside looking in, Chris had it all: a beautiful home, a thriving family, a new baby on the way. Shanann had often posted on social media about how blessed they were, portraying a life of happiness, love, and togetherness. But beneath the surface, there was another reality, one that Shanann, her family, and the world had no idea about. The unraveling of Chris's motives began with his affair, a secret life that he had carefully hidden from everyone around him. In the months leading up to the murders, Chris had started a romantic relationship with Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker he had met at his job. Their relationship had developed quickly, and it wasn't long before Chris began fantasizing about a future with her. A future that didn't include Shanann or their children. Nicole Kessinger would later tell investigators that she had believed Chris was already separated from Shanann, and that he was in the process of getting a divorce. She claimed she had no idea that Chris was still living with his wife and 2 daughters, and certainly no idea that Shanann was pregnant with their 3rd child. Chris had spun a web of lies, presenting himself as a man ready to move on from a failed marriage. To Nicole, he was the picture of a man starting fresh, a loving, attentive partner who was ready to build a new life. But to Shanann, he was still playing the role of devoted husband and father. As his relationship with Nicole deepened, Chris found himself increasingly trapped between 2 worlds. On one hand, he was expected to be the husband and father that his family needed him to be. On the other, he was consumed by his desire to start a new life with Nicole, a life that in his mind required a drastic and permanent solution. In the months before the murders, Shanann had noticed a change in Chris. He had become distant, cold, and uninterested in the family life he had once embraced. Shanann, always one to express her feelings openly, had sent Chris messages pleading with him to tell her what was wrong. She was worried about their relationship, about their future, and most of all, about the welfare of their children. Despite Shanann's attempts to reach out to Chris, his mind was already made up. The affair with Nicole had reignited something in him, a desire for freedom, for excitement, for a life unburdened by the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage. And as that desire grew, so did his willingness to do whatever it took to make that life a reality. Chris knew that divorce wasn't an option, not in his mind. He didn't want to deal with the financial strain, the legal battles, or the inevitable fallout from his family and friends. He wanted a clean break, and in his twisted logic, the only way to achieve that was to erase his family entirely. This wasn't a crime of passion, as some had initially speculated. Chris hadn't snapped in a moment of anger or rage. What he did was premeditated, cold, and calculated. He had carefully planned the murders, thinking through how he would dispose of the bodies and how he would explain their disappearance. In the days leading up to the crime, he had acted completely normal, going about his daily routine as if nothing was wrong, but inside he was plotting the destruction of his family. On the morning of August 13, 2018, Chris put his plan into action. After strangling Shanann in their bedroom, he had taken the time to methodically load her body into his truck. He then woke his 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, and drove them, with their mother's body beside them, to the oil field where he worked. The cold-blooded nature of his actions was almost incomprehensible. As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, it became clear just how much planning had gone into the murders. Chris had not acted impulsively. This had been premeditated. In the weeks leading up to the murders, he had researched how to dispose of bodies and even looked into the logistics of maintaining an affair without getting caught. He had spent time thinking through every detail, ensuring that he could carry out his plan without raising suspicion. But what Chris hadn't anticipated was the overwhelming guilt that would eventually consume him, leading to his eventual confession. In the days following the murders, Chris had appeared calm and collected. He gave interviews to the media, pleading for the safe return of his family, all while knowing exactly what had happened to them. But as the investigation intensified and the evidence mounted against him, the cracks in his story began to show. The weight of his lies became too much to bear, and it wasn't long before Chris was forced to confront the truth. The affair with Nicole Kessinger had been the catalyst for everything. It was the motivation behind Chris's desire to start a new life, and ultimately the driving force behind his decision to murder his family. In his mind, there was no other way out. He wanted freedom, and he was willing to kill for it. But what Chris failed to realize was that his actions would only lead to his own downfall. The lies, the deceit, the horrific acts of violence, they would all catch up to him in the end. The media attention surrounding the case had already begun to paint Chris as a suspect, and as investigators dug deeper into his life, the full extent of his double life was revealed. Chris had been living two separate realities. To his family and friends, he was the devoted husband and father, but to Nicole, he was a man ready to leave his old life behind and start anew. The tension between these two worlds had reached a breaking point, and in the end, Chris had made the decision to eliminate the life that no longer fit into his future plans. As the true depth of Chris Watts' deception and monstrous actions came to light, the world watched in disbelief. How could a man once seen as a loving father and husband commit such a barbaric act? The trial of Chris Watts, while swift, was not just a legal proceeding, it was a reckoning, a moment where the horrors he inflicted on his family were laid bare for all to see. In November 2018, Chris Watts faced the consequences of his unspeakable crimes. He had no defense left, no story to hide behind. The evidence was overwhelming, and the nation's collective grief weighed heavily upon the courtroom. In an effort to avoid the death penalty, Chris pleaded guilty to all charges: the first-degree murder of his pregnant wife Shanann, their two young daughters Bella and Celeste, and his unborn son Nico. The plea deal would spare his life, but it would condemn him to spend the rest of his days behind bars, haunted by the destruction he had wrought. The sentencing hearing was filled with raw, unfiltered emotion. Shanann's family had endured the unimaginable. They had lost a daughter, a sister, and 3 innocent grandchildren in the most brutal way possible. As they took the stand to deliver their victim impact statements, the weight of their pain was palpable. There were no words that could truly convey the depth of their heartbreak, but each statement was a poignant reminder of the lives stolen by Chris's selfish actions. Sandra Rzucek, Shanann's mother, addressed Chris directly. Her voice trembled with a mix of anger and sorrow as she recounted the trust she had once placed in him. "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them," she said, her voice breaking. "They also trusted you, the heartless monster you are." The courtroom fell silent as her words hung in the air, a powerful testament to the devastation that Chris had left behind. Frank Rzucek, Shanann's father, followed with his own heart-wrenching statement. His grief was evident in every word as he spoke of the profound loss he felt every day. "You took my family from me," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his pain. "I will never forgive you for what you've done. My grandbabies, my daughter, my grandson, they didn't deserve this." His words were a cry from the soul, a desperate plea for justice that could never truly be fulfilled. But perhaps the most gut-wrenching moment came when Shanann's brother Frankie took the stand. His bond with his sister had been strong, and the loss he felt was indescribable. "I wake up every morning, and the first thing I feel is the emptiness of their absence," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "They were my everything, and you took that away from me." He paused, his voice faltering as he tried to compose himself. "I hope you think about what you did every single day for the rest of your life." Chris sat motionless throughout the sentencing, his expression blank. There was no outburst, no visible sign of remorse. It was as if the gravity of what he had done hadn't fully registered in his mind. Or perhaps he was simply too far removed from any human emotion to care. His once carefully constructed facade had been shattered, and all that remained was the hollow shell of a man whose greed and selfishness had led him to destroy everything in his path. The judge handed down his sentence, 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for tampering with the bodies. Chris would spend the rest of his life in prison, isolated from the outside world with nothing but his guilt for company. It was a sentence that brought some measure of justice, but for Shanann's family, there could never be true closure. The pain of losing their loved ones would remain forever. In the months following the sentencing, the story of Chris Watts continued to capture public attention. His case became a symbol of betrayal, of a man willing to commit the ultimate act of violence to escape the life he no longer wanted. But beyond the sensational headlines, this story was about more than just the crime itself. It was about the victims, Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, whose lives were cut tragically short. They were innocent souls, taken by someone they should have been able to trust the most, and their memory would never be forgotten. Chris Watts' actions left a permanent scar on all those who knew Shanann and her daughters. Their friends, family, and community were left to grapple with the haunting question, how could this have happened? How could a man who appeared so ordinary, so unremarkable, commit such an unspeakable act? Was it the affair? Was it the pressure of maintaining his double life? Or was it something even deeper? A darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The answers to these questions may never be fully understood, but the impact of Chris Watts' actions will be felt for generations. As Chris serves out his sentence in prison, the world moves on, but the memory of Shanann and her children lives on. Their names are etched in the hearts of those who loved them, and their story serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of life. For those left behind, the path to healing is long, and the pain may never fully fade. But through it all, they continue to honor the memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. 4 lives taken too soon by a man who was supposed to protect them. As we conclude this chilling story, we are left with one final thought. Tragedies like this remind us of the darkness that can hide in the most unexpected places. The Watts family tragedy will forever be a testament to the horrors of deception, betrayal, and murder. It leaves us with questions that may never be answered, and it compels us to reflect on the vulnerability of those closest to us. If you believe that children and families should never suffer this kind of cruelty, subscribe to our channel. Only those who believe such acts should continue will avoid clicking that button. Let's ensure that the memory of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico lives on by spreading awareness and advocating for justice. What are your thoughts on this tragic case? How do you think we can prevent such horrors in the future? Share your comments below.